Thank you, everyone. Welcome. I appreciate the invitation from Missouri NARO. Always happy to be here. I'm Georgie Bana, NARO's Director of Policy and Program Development. I'll show you that slide in just a second. But we're here today to talk about crisis management strategies. And again, we're going to talk a little bit here about disasters, COVID, pandemics a little bit. And what do we do? How do we respond? What's going on? And just getting a sense of we can have a plan, we can have a process, we can work the process and really get through this without everything just blowing up and being a real problem. And so we'll talk about that, really trying to work through some of those pivot points and some of those forks in the road that we may get to. Before we get started, I do want to make sure to mention, feel free, I think in the chat, go ahead and drop any questions in there. I'll see those and we'll address those from time to time throughout today's session. So let's get started. Again, that's me. I'm Georgie Bana, NARO's Director of Policy and Program Development. Again, I'm in the National NARO office with my team. I'm with Policy and Program Development. We have a team of 3 of us, myself, then we have Eric Oberdorfer and Tushar Gurgel. Eric, our policy advisor, and Tushar, our policy analyst, who are really here to help and to gather information and share information. So please stay in contact with us. When we hear from Washington, from HUD headquarters, we want to share. We share with you, but we also want to hear from you as well, so we can take that local information and share it with HUD headquarters to make sure they know what's going on, what's really happening on the ground. My contact information will be at the end of the slides. I'll share that with you, and feel free to email me any questions, anything after the session. We're here and available for you. A little background about myself, just before we get going here too far in. I'm an attorney by trade, studied law at Michigan State University, practiced law at a district court as a court-appointed attorney, and did some private practice work for a while. Then I joined the Small Business Administration as a disaster attorney, and actually spent a number of months on the Gulf Coast and in Texas during Katrina and Rita, working through the loan process for the Small Business Administration, being one of their loan attorneys and making sure families and businesses get the resources they need to come back from that. And that's been a process that was really exciting. Really happy to help. Once that wrapped up, I moved back to Washington, D.C., joined a consulting firm working on HUD programs, really on the voucher program primarily, but programs in general, including the Indian housing programs, and really started my HUD career that way. A few years there, I joined NARO as a trainer. So I started my NARO career as a trainer, really talking and going around the country, training on voucher and public housing programs. And eventually, about 5 years ago, I joined NARO as their Director of Policy. And as they say, the rest is history. And here we are today. Again, really excited for the invitation. Always happy to prefer to come out and see you in person, but this works this time around. But hopefully next year, I'll be able to come out and see you guys in person. That'd be great. So let's go ahead and get rolling. So what is a crisis? We're talking about crisis management strategies, but we're going to start at the core, crisis. It's an emergency, it's a disaster. Something pops up, storms, hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, tornadoes, middle of the country. It could be ice storms, it could be weather, it can be man-made disasters as well. And it can be, as is a situation, a medical kind of emergency through the pandemic. Emergencies, crisis can also be strategic and organizational. There could be an issue just with your housing authority. There's an emergency internal to your housing authority, or it could affect not just the now of the agency, but the strategic planning going forward. This changes the way the housing authority is going to work going forward. There's always a key turning point in the disaster, in the crisis. There's a pivot point. There's always a point where decisions need to be made. We can only stay on the sideline for so long before, as leaders in our community, we need to step in and start making decisions. Now, those decisions, there are many types of decisions, but we're going to really focus on those urgent and important decisions. Again, we'll talk about what an urgent decision is. We'll talk about what an important decision is, and then how those sometimes are in conflict. Then also, sometimes how those can work together, and then and also how we make sure those work in a positive and try to result in a positive outcome of the situation. What we're in now, COVID-19, the pandemic, it really touches all of these. It's an emergency. It's a disaster. There's been national disaster. Each of the states has a federal disaster declaration. It affects our today. How do we get the PPE, the personal protective equipment that we need to keep our staff safe when they go in and do an emergency work order? It's also strategic. How long is this going to last? Are we planning out how are we planning to change our recertification process so we don't do those in person over the next year? So there's some strategy decisions have to be made. There's key turning points. We have a decision point already. We've had them. Some are very short term. Some are longer term. Where for many housing authorities now, they've chosen waivers that HUD has provided. There was an early decision point. Do we use those waivers? And sometimes part of that was how long do we use those waivers? HUD now has made some changes and extended some of those waivers, and we expect HUD to come out with new waiver notice in the next few weeks. And that too will bring more information. That creates a new turning point, a new decision point. And then there's decisions to be made. Some of those urgent decisions, some of those important decisions. We've already made some. We'll continue to make them throughout the process. And sometimes we'll have to revisit decisions. We made a decision to close our offices. NARA has done that. NARA closed our offices back in March, thinking probably only a few weeks. I still haven't been back into my office since March 17th. So in that case, now that's when do we start changing those decisions? When do we open up our office? So there's different decision-making points there. This pandemic really has brought all of that together. So now we look at values. What value should drive your decision-making? Okay, again, we all have decisions to be made. We have to look inside sometimes to how we're going to make those decisions. We always have policies. Again, our boards, or even if you're a commissioner, if you're on the board, you've adopted policies for your agency. That's a lot of information. But then the final decision is always with that person in charge. Probably that executive director is making the final decisions on a lot of things. And then a lot of these decisions, not even 5149. They're, 50.1 to 49.9. They're right on that edge. Which way do we go? So let's take a look at some of those drivers, those value drivers. Some of the key points, two big pieces: keeping people safe and then keeping organizational viable. So again, we got to think of our people first. So a lot of people we work with are our residents and our staff. We'll talk about our staff as part of the organization, though. But really, our customers, our people we interact with on a daily basis, are our residents. And some of the families, young families, middle-aged people, some with children. We also have elderly and disabled as well. We need to try to avoid infection. How do we minimize infection amongst our population that we have access to? Is that stopping non-emergency work orders right now? It might have been 3 months ago. It might not be now, or it might still be now. Again, different decision points, but how do we avoid infection? Do we close our lobby and not have the public come in? How many people do we allow in our lobby? Again, very, very the decision points there. Others, how do we help others avoid infection? So again, how do we help our families make sure their units and they're safe? Do we limit visitors? We saw a lot of assisted living facilities limit visitors, no outside visitors. We saw hospitals do that. That's a tough decision to make. Is that a decision we can make? Can we do that in our elderly public housing properties? Yeah, you need to take a look at what is available to you. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. State law, your policies may not allow that, but maybe they do. And then if people do get sick, how do we support those families? Not only our staff, but our residents as well. We have a sick resident. Do we have quarantine facilities? Do we take a public housing unit that's offline and make that a quarantine unit? Another decision point. Or do that person need to stay in that household and then potentially the entire family gets sick? How do we interact with the health department? What are their considerations? What are their discussions? And helping those who are economically disrupted. Luckily, our programs are well designed for this. Public housing voucher, the income process, the recertification process is well designed for economic disruption, right? Families can come in, get an interim recertification, and because of the drop in income or drop in hours that causes the drop in income, or even a lost job, their rent then will go down. Because remember, we have rent, income-based rent. So they come in, it drops down, their income drops down, they come in, talk to our staff, or contact our staff, provide evidence of the drop, and then we can lower their rent. Again, remember, we've had eviction moratoriums off and on through this entire process. The CARES Act had an eviction moratorium that went from March 27th through July 24th. Then there was a pause, no eviction moratorium. Then the CDC came in with eviction moratorium September 4th that runs now through the end of the year. One similarity in both of those eviction moratoriums, the rent was still owed. The rent was never forgiven for any of those situations. So even for our families, it's important they come and do those interim recertifications because that's how they lower their rent. The rent they still owe if they were economically disrupted. Again, we have some tools in our programs that other programs don't have. The low-income housing tax credit program doesn't have these tools. It's still affordable housing, but it doesn't have the tools that that some of the other programs do, our public housing and voucher particularly. Other private market don't have these same rules. The rent is the rent. Let's look at the organization for a minute here. So not only we have our focus on our residents, we need to focus on our business. And yes, the Housing Authority is a business. You need to make sure the Housing Authority makes it through this disaster, this crisis, right? The decisions you make to help your families, sometimes if your organization is not there, you can't make those decisions. The organization is the backbone that lets you make a lot of these decisions to protect your families. Part of that is protecting your staff, making sure you have that PPE, not for just the front for the office staff, but also your maintenance staff. Are they going in masks, gloves? Do they have foot cover, booties to make sure there's not tracking anything into units? Maybe are you bringing masks for the family members who are in the unit when the maintenance come in, that you give them masks to wear if they're not wearing a mask. So everyone in the unit is wearing a mask while the maintenance staff is there. Again, protecting your staff, your office staff, making sure you have the plexiglass dividers, or you have the stations now at your front desk. Have you gone to a A/B schedule for your staff, where half your staff comes in on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the other staff come in on Tuesday, Thursday, and then they alternate weeks. So if someone gets sick in the A group, it doesn't affect the B group potentially. Then you can continue working. So if everyone's in at the same time, maybe the entire staff will get infected. Operational decisions. Taking advantage of, HUD has provided additional funding for both the public housing and the voucher programs. Using that funding strategically and making good decisions with it. Allowing those funds to be used for daily activities that are eligible expenses in both the public housing and the voucher program. That's allowed. So you can buy that PPE. So you can make sure to try to get the families and your staff the proper equipment that's needed. There may also be connections with PPE sellers. We've seen a lot of connections for housing authorities where they've never had a real classification before, but they've been able to get classified either as a government entity or potentially a first responder. And that moves them up lists for PPE from the state or from vendors. So again, there can be potential opportunity there to get your business the equipment that they need to safely operate. Okay, but those are our big drivers, keeping our customers safe and keeping our business safe. Very, very important. So in a crisis, those are always two of our most important values we carry forward. So we still get to a decision point, and we get a dilemma when we get to decision point sometimes. Do we make a fast decision or do we make a slow decision? Not always the best descriptive words there. Is it an urgent decision? Does the decision have to be made sooner than later? That can sometimes be called a fast decision. The slow decision may be considered an important decision where we need more time. So again, slow is protective. It means it protects. It takes time to make a decision. We need more information. It's more important to be right than to be fast sometimes. But there are two different types of decisions. There are urgent decisions, which need to be made today. We have a stay-at-home order early on. Many states, and even some now, still have. Do we close our office? We're considered a first responder in our community. Can we close our office? Do we do that now? Because again, tomorrow, are they coming in or not? And that's a decision to be made. Or do we take a little more time and, for the next decision after we close, which is an urgent decision, for the important decision, how do we retool our office to make sure it's safe going forward? This is when we get the plexiglass dividers. This is when we make sure we get the PPE. We set people home to be safe. Now we're going to make our office safe, but that's a longer term process. So again, every crisis presents that dilemma. You can go fast or you can go slow in a decision. Sometimes going fast, you may not always make the right answer, but that's okay. You made the answer that was right in the moment. It doesn't mean it's right tomorrow, and maybe you have to revisit that decision tomorrow, but in the moment, it was the right answer for the situation. Or do you go slow, pause, continue moving forward, and make a decision at a later date? It is important as a leader to make sure we make that decision, to determine that decision, the triage of that decision. Is it an urgent decision, or is it important? So again, really going to this fast and slow analogy with it. If you know what to do, if you have your set of emergency procedures in place, a lot of agencies have an emergency procedure manual or emergency procedure policy. Some agencies don't. If you know it, you have a disaster, you have a natural disaster, a tornado that comes in, certain things are going to happen. Did any of us have a pandemic response plan? Probably not. The best we could do is try to adapt our current plan. And if it works, we have it right there. We can make decisions very quick. We can be a leader by making that decision a little bit faster and show our community we're taking the lead, we're protecting our people, we're protecting our staff, we're making a decision right now. Even before the city, county, state, federal government has mandated things. But it's also okay if you don't know. We don't know how this pandemic affects us directly. What does this mean? We provide housing. We need to make sure we can still service that housing in an appropriate manner. It's going to take us a couple days to work through that process. We don't have that laid out in our emergency plan. And again, that's okay. We go through, maybe you find information from a fellow housing authority who's done this and who has made decisions and said, here's our procedures were a little more in line with a pandemic response and has been working for us the last couple of days. Here's some information. A little bit slower, you follow. Neither one is right or wrong. Okay? The decision to go fast or go slow is based on the facts you have at hand and the type of decision that needs to be made. Sometimes you can make it, sometimes you have to wait to make it, and that's okay. As a good rule of thumb, though, is that bottom line. Don't go any faster than you must. Again, you can lead. You can be the first one to do something. But if you don't have enough information, you're just making a little bit of a blind decision, then it might just be luck if you're right. It's not because of the knowledge. Chances are you may not be right. Yeah, we can be a little extra protective in this coronavirus situation by closing in and closing the ranks, but you try not to go any faster than you have to. More information, more time is always advantageous. You can make a better decision with more information. But at some point, you need to make the decision. And at some point, that line, you come up to that line, and you have to make the decision today, now. And that's okay. Just take as much time as you can based on the information you have, based on can you get the information you need to make the decision. Crisis teams. Crisis teams are very important. And again, leadership is important in our agencies during this time. But the executive director is not the only leader in the agency. Smaller agencies have less people, that's fine. Larger agencies have more people. But you generally have a few people in an agency that are part of that executive team or that decision-making team. Executive director, deputy director, maybe director of public housing, director of vouchers, director of procurement, director of maintenance. Those are all very important people to have around you, to have that team in place that can process information. More heads will help in this to process information, and even though we process it maybe a little differently, come a little different results, that discussion will, the sum of the parts is greater in that situation with that discussion. So aggregating and assimilating information. Lots of different departments have different information, have the details. How many public housing units do we have? How many occupied public housing units do we have? Sometimes even more important. You're the public housing director. How many voucher families do we have? How many leased up vouchers do we have? How many landlords does that constitute? That's maybe a different number. We may have a single landlord with multiple families. Making sure we know who we have to reach out to for information. Okay, so again, getting that information, bringing all that information into this team provides us a brain trust that decisions can be made at. And then you can make decisive action based on the knowledge that we have, based on my team, based on the information provided. Whoever has that decision-making capacity or that decision-making responsibility can make that decision. That's important. But it's also important to have that chain of command in place. Who steps in if leader A, the executive director, is not available? Does the deputy step in? Does the board chair step in? All decisions should be made ahead of time. Again, most situations for hiring authority, the deputy director, the staff continue the day-to-day operations. Okay, and again, it's because becoming incapacitated. Maybe they have to quarantine. Maybe they've become ill, have to quarantine, and then they can come back at a later time. Maybe they can continue to make the decision-making process, particularly if you're working from home. There's some flexibility potentially there that might work. But again, what are the processes that hand off decision-making to the next person in the chain of command? Very important to have that structure in place so everyone knows where to look. Executive director is out, deputy steps in, is making those decisions, maybe in consultation with the ED at that point, but if they're incapacitated, not available, making those decisions until these ED can be back in that position of command, and then it's handed back over to them. The protocol, again, we have our, we have our decision. We know types of decisions we might have. So we're gonna have to, where does that fit in? We know the who's making decisions, but what's the process? What's that crisis protocol? What happens when there is a crisis? What activates the crisis management process and the crisis protocol? Here are the real major steps to it. It's identifying when do we need to activate crisis management? What are the issues? What is the situation that we're coming into? Not every situation is a crisis. Some are just run-of-the-mill decisions of business decisions. Crisis puts an added emphasis, an added pressure on it, because sometimes the decisions made in a crisis can sometimes have far-reaching effects. It's not a decision whether we buy toilet paper A or toilet paper B. That's not a decision-making crisis. We decide on our issues. Who are we going to keep interest in? Remember what our values are? Our customers, our families, and our business, our staff. We're always focusing on the people. What are some of the risks? What happens if we send everyone home and close our office? What are some of the downsides of that? Who's going to answer the phone? Do the phones forward to another line at somebody's house or to their cell phone where our front desk person can answer those phones still, so like nothing's gone down? Or do we now have no one answering phones? That's a risk. We need people to have information. Then we contain the crisis. Try to get our arms wrapped around it. Part of that is the decision-making process. Triage decisions. What's urgent? What's important? Some decisions aren't either. They can be made later. Again, urgent needs to be done now. Important needs to be done sooner than later, probably, but you have a little bit of time to make. It's better to take time in an important decision. Urgent, we don't have the luxury of time. Important, we may not have a lot of luxury of time, but it's important enough that we pause and take a little bit of time for an important decision. That helps us deliver those options and deadlines. When does that important decision turn into an urgent decision? We haven't made it. We decided it's important. We need a little time. At some point, we get to a wall, get to a line where it needs to be made, and now it's an urgent decision. It needs to be made in the next moments, hours, something like that. At that point, you make a decision, and based on the aggregated information and disseminating information, making sure you share that decision. If we decide to close our office, how do we tell our staff? Do we activate an emergency response system that we have where we text people? NARA has an emergency texting system. So even if we're not in the office, we can get the information we need in an emergency situation as staff. No housing authorities, also some housing authorities in the country have that for their residents as well. The residents provide their cell phone numbers or a text available number that in case of emergency, then the agency can send a text out to the residents as well. So who are those key stakeholders then? And what do we do? What do they value now? So again, we've talked about very internal so far, right? We've talked about our residents. We talked about our staff, our business. How do we internally make decisions? What we also need to talk about in a moment of crisis as well is how do our stakeholders, who's outside of our bubble, in that sense, but who's bubble adjacent? Who's our vendors to bring in that personal protective equipment? Who's bringing food or resources into our families? Or even potentially our health providers. Who's our health department? Our city, county, our key stakeholders. And what's their issues that they need us help with? Excuse me. All important, and this really should be started before a crisis. The crisis you go to people you trust in a crisis. And so that to build that trust, it happens, it's an ongoing thing. It starts from day one, when people come into the new job, the new executive director, new mayor, building trust starts from day one. It takes an expertise. As executive director, as staff, you need to know what you're doing. The outside stakeholder needs to know you have an expertise in something. You have a knowledge that when I need it, when I have a question that relates to that knowledge, I know where to go. Do they come to you? Or do they go to the housing authority, the county over? Who do they talk to? You want to be that expertise resource for them. Some of it's through commitment. You build that trust through commitment by being part of the community. Commitment to values. Your values are to your residents, to your staff, to your community. You're part of that active community as a housing authority. That mayor, city council, other businesses in the community can see that commitment. Maybe you're on committees together, on Chamber of Commerce, other committees, and you build through those relationships. Transparency is also very important. Do people understand how you're making your decisions? Does it just seem you have this whole housing authority over there? Is it just one dude, one woman, one man making decisions without any kind of understanding or any other input from the community? Or understanding how that agency takes information They're from aggregating that information, from assimilating that information from their departments, from their leadership, bringing in that information from other resources, and use that information to make the most educated decisions. Again, the more information you have up front, the easier urgent decisions can be made. Again, you don't need to wait for more information. You already have a lot of information in an urgent decision. You need, all right. And then you can make that decision. And finally, making sure there's empathy. You're all in the same situation locally, in your community. Making sure everyone understands that you're following your values and you're understanding about the other people, other businesses, and other people in your community. Taking that understanding and saying, yeah, we can get through this together. Again, let's work together. Let's make sure we coordinate. We have information we have information you need, you have information we need. Let's share that information. Let's cast that wider net, gather all the information, and as a community, we can make the right decisions for the entire community. Excuse me. Some of the communication skills that are very important in this process. Again, we're in a crisis. We don't always have our normal channels that we always go through. But some of the questions you need to be asking is, who are you talking to? Who is bringing you information? Be specific about labeling key stakeholders. I need information about a certain thing. I need information about PPE. Who am I going to? Is it my county emergency management system? Or is it Google? Is it Amazon? Are they providing me the PPE that I need? And who is my local key stakeholder for this activity that I need? Then, what are you telling them? This is particularly when you're talking about any kind of media as well. What are the messages you're trying to get out? When you're talking to Amazon about PPE, are you telling them you're a first responder? You're essential employees for your local community. They may ask you to fill out some paperwork. You do that, they don't have the information. That's what you're telling them. You're important to our community. We need you to help us get the equipment that we need. Then what are they hearing? Again, are they really at that point, is it a two-way communications? Is it a two-way street? Are you actually partnering? Making sure they, that generally who you're working with has the same values or same commitments that you have. They're caring about the same things. Again, sometimes that's on the purchasing side, sometimes that's on the service side. Who's providing, who you're working with for Meals on Wheels. That local small nonprofit running Meals on Wheels may be having a very hard time. Can you help provide them some additional assistance and maybe meet them halfway because they're serving your residents? Maybe there's a way you can help them as well. Okay. Communicating effectively is also very, very important. I think it's kind of a step back. We're talking now. Part of a crisis management situation is not only the decisions that you're making, but how those decisions are being heard by the outside. So some of this is your communication message, your communication toolkit. How do you get information to people that they can share that information with others? Are you in communication with your local newspaper? Are you in communication with your local news, TV news station? Who are those best media stakeholders? So again, remember, it's very easy for us to get press in bad times. We have someone get injured on our property, somebody, heaven forbid, a murder on our property. First people there are newspaper, TV crews. They're looking for the negative story. A crisis is a time to rise above that and really try to step up and be seen as a leader in your community. Again, most of you already are seen that way. This is an opportunity to solidify that in your local community. How are you, again, making sure your low and very low income families have appropriate housing, to keep that housing in this time of pandemic so they can stay safe and not and try to minimize the the spread of COVID-19. Create a centralized authority source for information. Again, very important here, making sure your agency speaks with one voice. Okay, speaking with one voice is very important in any kind of crisis situation. And generally, crises have a negative context, but they can always be put out there, almost always in a positive light. How are we responding to it in a proper way? And then how are we moving forward? And how are we trying to resolve so this does not happen again, or how we minimize the impacts going forward? But that who's speaking for you is very important. Is it your executive director that's speaking for you? Is it your board chairperson that's speaking for you? Maybe they both speak, but if they're both speaking, they need to have the same talking points. They need to be on the same page. Because the last thing you need is have problems communicating internal to the agency. If the agency can't communicate internally, there's no way it can communicate externally. And then there's no way to have a cohesive, comprehensive story, positive story going out from the agency. It's always going to be fragmented. And then there's going to be people playing off the two stories. Well, they said this. Well, she said that. That's not a way, a process for success. So again, making sure who has the appropriate authority to speak. It may, in certain situations, it may be the director of maintenance. Probably not COVID-19. It's probably the executive director is going to be your main front spokesperson. But you may have a director of communication. You may, for large agencies, smaller agencies, probably is going to be an executive director. And again, making sure as an executive director, you're keeping your board informed, because the board needs that information. If the board doesn't have the information, they're going to ask for the information. And the last thing you need them to do is ask for that information from the press. Again, both have responsibilities. Boards and staff have responsibilities to make sure that each other are on the same page, and you're both on the same team. You're both there for the housing authority. If the housing authority has problems, you both have problems. So if the housing authority has successes, you both have success. So you want to make sure to maximize that success. You may end up suspending regular marketing messages. You may stop, smaller, some agencies in more rural areas may actually need to advertise to make sure they meet occupancy and utilization requirements. If you may stop those regular messages, you may have already an onslaught of calls and contacts. So you may stop that regular messaging. You may change to some other form of messaging as well. Again, here's our weekly update on our COVID-19 response. Maybe you've never done a weekly update or a weekly press conference before, but now you might. So again, the regular process may change. The way you normally give out information, now you may go to a more structured process, or maybe a less structured process. See what works for you. But maybe as a housing authority, you want to make sure that your community knows that you're actively engaged, attacking this and processing the COVID-19 pandemic, and you're doing it respectfully and in a proper way. Getting the information out there, you controlling the story is sometimes a very, very important way of doing that. Stepping back a little bit now, again, we're talking a lot about process, having a communication process, having the decision-making tree, having that crisis protocol. Lots of things need to be done. And we'll talk a little more about those, and then we'll go into remembering our why. But always having some kind of emergency plan. Again, make sure you dust it off from time to time. Get in there, take a look at it. Now, many of us will add a pandemic portion to that emergency plan. It's not just going to be weather related at this point. Majority of our emergencies are generally natural disaster, kind of weather related, whether it's snow, hurricane, tornadoes. West Coast now we're seeing a lot of fires. All those components tend, to the natural disaster side, tend to make it into our plans. Pandemics generally don't. We haven't had a pandemic of this reach in years, in decades. So again, now we've now designed a lot based on that. Now we probably codify that into our plans, into our emergency procedures, and that's a good thing. Every time we learn something new, Let's write that down. Let's put it into our plans, again, as an option or as a new process going forward. It's a very important learning tool, the way the pandemic can be. But remember, your why is also very important. We can do paper all every day. No doubt. We know how to be compliant with paper, making sure we're checking the right boxes, making sure we're checking the right things on the computer screen, on the PIC system, and in our VMS systems and all our HUD systems. But remember why you're doing it. Really looking at those values. Helping our community, making sure our families have decent, safe, sanitary housing. We're also probably a hub of employment. We provide employment to a number of people in our community, making sure our staff are healthy, making sure our staff are prospering. Why are we doing this? As a reminder here too, feel free to put questions in. Now's a good time to put those questions into the queue, and we'll address those in just a few minutes. But looking at these couple of pictures like that up here are all from housing authorities, but look at the enjoyment that the staff are having here. They're working up in the upper left, they're working with high school students getting ready for college entrance tests or college applications. Middle picture, music class. Look at the joy on the faces. This is why we're doing this. We're doing all of these things now to making sure we can check the right boxes, making sure we can make the right decisions to make sure these kids have the housing they need so they can prosper going forward. We're helping families get those leases, sometimes home ownership. We're welcoming families into our properties, welcoming families into our community. We really are a hub to our community. We really do make sure we provide decent, safe housing, sanitary housing. We're making sure we're providing the services that our families need. We really do, without us, a lot of things wouldn't happen in our communities. And we need to sometimes step back and remember that. Let's go ahead and take a look at some questions here. I know we have some time for a couple here. Let me see what we have. And a couple, I think, getting ready to come in. Yeah, I see a couple here. Again, feel free to go in the chat, drop in a question there. One of the questions that comes up that I've seen a number of times is what happens if you didn't start this process last year? What if you get to a crisis and don't have an emergency plan, don't have a communication plan? What do you do? Where do you go from here? Where do you make sure where you're going? And that's okay. Again, a lot of times, some of the best plans and some of the best resources come out of crisis, come out of emergency. One of the keys is to make sure we're documenting our processes now. How did we handle March? Did we shut down our business? What was the decision-making process? Again, it might have been very hectic back then, but if you could note the process that was taken, who did you talk to? Which staff were involved in decisions? Where were the staff? What type of decisions were made? Document that process. Do you see a theme in that process? That's very important. That will let you now, as things calm down. Arguably, we're still in the middle of this pandemic. We're in the second, sometimes some are saying the third wave of it. We now, based on experience, can make the same or different decisions. Again, we learn making different decisions doesn't mean the previous decision was wrong. It just means we need a new decision for our current situation. And it's okay to adjust and adapt based on the current situations. But again, writing things down, when there is a moment of pause, when there's a moment of calm, documenting those, bring those then as policies, emergency policies, crisis management policies, communication plans, communication policies. Generally, these are big enough policies. The board should be involved in that process, and these will go through the normal board process of open meetings and public comment. But again, in those quiet times, when there is a quiet moment, you can start that process of bringing those to the board and start having new processes in place. Again, absolutely fine that you didn't have one in place. Again, now you learn you probably needed one. Now you'll have one for next time. And that's how we learn going forward. So not a major issue, but we make sure we have understandings. Remember too, again, not always the easiest thing to do in the situation, but stepping back and looking at your entire operations in a sense. And this is not only, and sometimes we've been forced to do this now, how do we run our programs? The public housing program, the voucher program. Are we required to meet in person? We've had this discussion with HUD for an annual recertification. Does the family have to come in person? There's nothing in the regulations that require that. And HUD is looking at that. Can we do recertifications by mail? Can we do them by video? The answer is yes. And HUD arguably doesn't need to approve those. We've just always in the past done this in person. When we do verified income, we do the verified family composition, we've just always done it in person. Now through the waivers and through some of the processes, we're not doing that. Again, but if you look at the waivers, all they've done is instead of a public comment period for plans and for board meetings, you can do that online. If you notice, none of the waivers address recertifications in person because, again, it's not part of the statute, the regulations. It's something you could have already done. HUD is just giving you few frequently asked questions, some additional information. Can you do your voucher orientation online? And the answer is yes. But again, you just got to make sure the information is shared. That's the most important part, making sure that all the information is there and to the families. Let's see, what else is going on here? Real question to talk about some of the chain of command and some of that discussion. Again, hopefully that's not a discussion that you're having on the fly. Again, there should be some kind of clear delegation of authority on what that delegation of authority process is. And the larger the agency, the more defined that tends to be. Smaller the agency, less people, less defined. Again, if you only have a executive director and your deputy director is in charge of is your director of public housing, and then you have a maintenance director, it's a 3-person shop. Again, can be very easy to delineate the authority at that point. But if something happens where the executive director can't make a decision, they're in the hospital for some reason, that deputy director and the maintenance director, the deputy director may have only been there a couple of years. The maintenance director has been there 15 years. They need to know who's making the decisions going forward. The maintenance directors normally goes to the executive director for certain purchasing questions over a certain threshold, dollar amount. They need to make sure they're asking now the deputy, because the deputy is the one, if the authority is in that deputy. But that maintenance director may not always feel that they need to go to a deputy. I've never reported the deputy before. Why am I reporting now? Well, it's because the ED is not available. It's not a permanent thing. It's because the executive director is not available right now. So again, some of us now are in a little bit of a pause, a little bit of calm in the storm. Maybe time to start looking at that again. Did it work? One of the most important things for all your policies and all your plans is when you've activated them, to go back and see, did that work? Did that decision tree work? Did that system work for your communications team? Did the information get to the appropriate people in the right amount of time, fast enough? If the answer is no, we may need to look for different solutions and have a different process. If the answer is yes, that just validates, good, we're on the right track. Let's now see, maybe that service has other things we can use as well. So again, always important there to make sure that you're reevaluating your policies and plans. They never let them sit on the shelf and get dusty. Always knock them off, take a look. Now that emergency plan, which we may have never used before, even though we may have updated a couple times, now we've used it. Did it work? If it worked, great. If it didn't work, now is the time. When the calm of the storm comes, now is the time to make those updates. Let's see. Let me go here. While we're answering questions, let me give you our contact information just to make sure you have that. I got a couple more slides we need to go over, but we'll answer some questions over the slide in the next few minutes as well. Yeah, I'm George Bana, NARO's Director of Policy. There's my email address, gbana@naro.org. I also included Tess Henry, our Director of Congressional Relations. She may have spoken to a few of you earlier today at the Legislative Committee meeting. She's, again, our main contact person with the Hill, with Congress. I do most of the contact work with HUD and the federal agencies. Together, we're quite a team to make sure that all parts of the federal government get touch information that they need. The websites you see on the screen as well, naro.blog is a great resource for hot topics. We post there when something new happens. Usually one of the first places that pops up is on Naro blog. Naro.org/coronavirus. If things have, it's a great resource for up-to-date and current coronavirus information. Yeah, but dating all the way back to March. If things have changed, you didn't think it was if it didn't affect you too much in April or May, now it's affecting you more, please go to that site. There's a lot of, we have all the information there going backwards. Please take a look. There's websites, there's webinars on there, there's handouts, there's PDFs, lots of information, not just from HUD, but also from various other federal agencies, Department of Labor. At the time, there was some Treasury for IRS discussion as well. And the last one is naro.org/advocacy. This is where you can go to interact with your members of Congress, see what Tess is focused on when talking to both the House and the Senate. But also there is the NARO Advocacy Center, Action Alert Center, where you can send letters to your members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate. And from time to time, we activate the administration as well. You can send letters, pre-written letters on the main topics we're focused on for affordable housing. Right now is getting another COVID-19 package through, as well as fiscal year 2021 funding. Again, we're in the new fiscal year, but we don't have a full year budget yet. So we are asking Congress to make sure that's a priority. It's not going to happen before the election, but when they come back, hopefully we'll have some work done on that in December. So again, lots of great information there. Let's see. Other questions that might pop up. Again, there's still room in the queue. Please feel free to drop in any questions there, and I can get to those. Other crisis management. Let's see. As a housing authority, how do you start that trust building that's with your key stakeholders? How do you really get that process going? Like I said before, look at your relationships you already have. You might be part of the Chamber of Commerce. The mayor, city council may already have some housing committees or housing boards already in place. Also, your Board of Commissioners can also be very good resources here. Again, a lot of times they may be politically appointed. The mayor, city council, county may appoint those, but they also, so there's a little bit of political connection there, but also they usually provide some other business and other connections as well. So as an executive director, to try to get the housing authority information out, use your boards. Your boards can be, again, very locally connected generally. And that you can maximize that connection to their businesses and to their resources, and that casts the wider net for the housing authority and the information that the housing authority wants to share. But again, it's not always the easiest thing to start. This communication in trust building during a pandemic, during a crisis, but it is what it is, and we start the discussion. Again, in many areas, we've had a little bit of a lull from the initial March, April timeframe. Now we're starting to see a little more peak, but during that lull, some normalcy came back to some meetings. Instead of being in person, though, they may have been online. But again, try to make sure that you're building those local political connections, mayor's office, maybe city council, local code enforcement, all very connected sides there. But also then look at your business connections. Talk to your bank. Your bank is a resource for you. they're holding a lot of your money. That then becomes, your value to that bank. So you can start conversations. Your other providers, your other people you purchase from. So who do you purchase your maintenance equipment from? Your daily maintenance. Who are your big vendors for construction work? Again, you're making connections, starting conversations, and trying to build that team and those partnerships going forward. Always an important way. Excuse me. So let me see. I think there's one more. Any other questions out there? Please drop them in the chat, because we're about to keep things moving here. Okay, one last one, I think. Decisions. Yeah, decisions. Looking at the urgent decisions, looking at the important decisions, which one, aren't they all important to get? Isn't it important to get all of them the right decisions? Is really the question. And how should we focus on making those decisions? When we have a lot of decisions to be made. You're actually right. That's actually a great point. At the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of things happened at the same time. It was one day when normal operations, and this is how it was for NARO, our office in Washington, D.C., we were coming in every day. We could see, certain areas. New York was starting to getting bad. We were still in the office. We were still commuting. I commute by train in and out from Maryland into Washington, D.C. That was still, everything was rolling smoothly there. And then all of a sudden, things got to a tipping point. And the mayors of D.C. started saying, talking about things. Most of the business community they initially started the discussions. And so it's a little bit of, that leadership follow discussion. We tend to be, there's a little bit of a herd mentality there. We all kind of go in the same direction. And not that there's nothing wrong with that. If everyone decided to close their businesses and, that was good. Unfortunately, some businesses couldn't afford to close. And so then that becomes an issue. The CARES Act helped a little bit with that, with the PPP money to help make sure small businesses and businesses could keep employment up and running. But again, decision making, you deal with decisions that are put in front of you. You don't make other people's decisions. You're going to have enough decisions as in your leadership role that you need to just worry about your own decisions. From time to time, executive directors may talk to other business leaders, and they may start discussing other decisions that they've had to make. But again, focusing on your decisions is most important, and keeping that in that lens of your values. Who are you working for? I'm working for my residents. I'm working for my staff. I keep my staff healthy. I keep my residents healthy. My units are going to be safe. My residents are healthy. My business will work. We'll figure out, and we'll make the decisions necessary through the process if my staff are safe and healthy. So again, we can go work out. We can work at home. We can work offline. So again, it's making sure you keep a focus on your decisions, and then make the decisions as they need to be made. I think that's also like that one slide said, don't make decisions any faster than you have to. You must. There's going to be enough decisions to be made. Take them as they come. Don't let decisions jump to the front of the line. Because again, other decisions may inform that decision down the line when you didn't have to make tomorrow's decisions today. Make today's decisions, will inform tomorrow's decisions, and the same for the day after that. You take things as they come. It's most important. All right, let's take a look here. Let's wrap up a couple things again. There's my email address, gbana@naro.org. Please feel free to send me any questions. Reach out to me afterwards. We are available here. Again, not just on crisis management stuff, but all your housing authority program pieces as well. We're going to wrap up here. Just want to make sure we have all our, in a sense, our ducks in a row. Just like every crisis, I want to make sure everything is lined up. Let's just touch on a couple of things as we close out here. Again, we're all facing an unprecedented set of crises, right? We have never dealt with this before. We've never dealt with a pandemic like this before. Some of those before us have, but it's been a long time. So we're dealing with this fresh. Now, as leaders in our community, we're leaders for a reason. Step up. We're going to step up. We're going to make the decisions we need to make sure our people are safe, and that's leadership. We're worried about the things we can control. We can lead those that we have, those we can affect. Define those values going forward. Again, protecting your families, protecting your staff. HUD has encouraged us to do that. Very, very important, very direct to the point, making sure you keep yourselves safe, but yourselves as staff and yourselves as residents. Your crisis team is going to be there to lean on. Again, you've put your staff together. Your staffs are all leaders in their own capacity. They lead their own teams. You lead them. So make sure your leaders are all in the same room when important decisions are being made and when they can provide the information that's needed. Again, you're not trying to pass the buck to anyone. You're not trying to pass authority to. You just want your best minds in the room, and you have your best minds. You've hired your staff. You have your staff in place. You trust them with their jobs. Trust them to give you information. They'll give you the information that they have, and then you can make that decision. And it's going to be clear, decisive authority that you have. Always clear decisions that come in front of you. Urgent, important. Those are always going to be your first ones. Get important, you usually have a little more time. Urgent needs to be done now. Let urgent decisions inform your important decisions. Again, every decision that comes before a decision helps the next decision. There's a process in place: identify, contain the situation, then resolve the situation. Again, don't go, yes, this is a situation we haven't dealt with before, but we got to take it step by step. Look at the field, identify the situation, put the walls around that situation. Okay, this is what we're going to deal with today. And then you resolve that issue. Identify, contain, and resolve. Most important thing about building trust, not only within your agency, amongst your staff and amongst your residents, but in your community as well, even on your outside key stakeholders, is empathy. You're all in this together. For the whole community, you all need to be pulling in the same direction. You all need to be focused on your community. Each of you focusing on your own part of the community, but as a whole, you're focused on the community. We're in this together. We can come through the other side of this. And again, remember your families, remember the kids you're serving, remember the elderly you're serving, remember your staff. That's why we're doing this. That's why we're making sure we're all there. You are doing a great job. We hear great stories from many of our leaders across the country that agencies are doing a great job. Your Missouri agencies are doing a great job as well. Really are focusing on your residents, focusing on your staffs. We're here at National NAR to help provide some backup, provide some assistance. Really can be a sounding board for those decision-making processes. But keep up the good work. Thank you for the invitation again. Really do appreciate speaking with Missouri NARO. And again, hopefully next year we'll do this in person.
We love having you, Georgie.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Any more questions for Georgie before we wrap up for the session? No? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and post the game code up here. Everybody make sure you write that down so you can get your points for attending this session.
We'll stop sharing it.